Hello, everyone, and welcome to Simplify Network Automation with NetGroom. I'm your host, and we have a special guest today, Hank Preston. I'm sure most of folks know Hank, but if you don't, Hank, would you mind introducing yourself? What's your current role at Cisco?
Yeah,
And how's it been going?
that's good. Yeah. So, Hank Preston, I'm a principal engineer here at Cisco. These days, I'm in our learning and certifications organization. And so that's the part of Cisco that puts together the certifications for CCNA and CCNP, CCIE, and obviously the DevNet Associate and professional and experts. We build the training materials, we host the labs for the classes, we put the exams together. And so that's kind of the land these days. The last several years, I've spent time kind of helping our lab and systems and automations teams, the folks, that's the part of our organization that kind of runs all of the labs. So if you take a DevNet Associate or the DevCore training class through Cisco U, those labs run out of our systems. And so we've got a large engineering team that builds and maintains those. And like probably many of you out there, right, we're trying to update and modernize and bring in automation and bring in concepts related to kind of just improving architecture and engineering and monitoring and integrating all of these things and network to code and net DevOps and all of these things that we're all trying to do, right? That's what my last several years have been, is trying to figure out how these concepts that Adrian and I, and when we were all in DevNet, kind of talking about and kind of the art of the possible, right? I've been trying to figure out, okay, let's take the art of the possible and figure out how it fits into the practicality side of it. And so it's been a fun handful of years on that side of the table. So
Uh, that's um, that's always interesting, right? Because we advocate, we evangelize automation and all that, but it's once you get your hands on it and you try to actually make it into a production environment, that's where you actually learn the most. I found because yeah, you always hit some barriers, some issues. So that's a given. So for folks, Hank, that haven't seen your sessions before or seen events that you've been at, tell us about a bit about your background. So how did you get here? Because I know you had an interesting trajectory from getting to where you are from where you started. So I think it's gonna be inspiring for folks just to hear that if they haven't before.
oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. So everybody I think has their own interesting kind of path, and it's always curious to talk to folks. Some of you might know Stuart Clark, Big Evil Beard. He's got an
Yeah.
interesting one. He used to cut hair, right? I don't know how interesting mine is in relation to that, but I mean, I didn't get in originally into technology. If I go far enough back, right? I was originally my first job out of college, and my degree in college was technical theater. It was lighting, sound, stage design. I did a wee bit of acting here and there. And then I got into technology because I was always interested in it. And working professional theater is a night job, and so my days were open, right? So I had mornings and afternoons open, and so I started to take some community college classes in just about anything technology related. So I did some classes in network infrastructure. So I took some NetAcad classes. So I still work with NetAcad. I actually recently started teaching some classes at a local school, kind of full circle for me going back. But that my interest in IT was kind of piqued by going through things like operating systems basics and the A plus certification and even some programming, right? So I went through and took introduction to comp sci and database development and web development. I started basically with just anything that happened to fit in my schedule. I learned a few things. Technology is pretty cool. The hours, maybe some of you work really late, and we certainly can do that, but the hours were better than working professional theater, right? I generally didn't have to work till midnight most days, or I don't now. And the pay was a whole lot better as I went through on that side, go figure on the piece. And so I eventually pivoted my career, went back fully to school, got a master's degree in information systems, and then kind of made my way into IT. I originally wasn't on the network or infrastructure side. I was more kind of a general purpose kind of engineer. Did a little bit, actually did some coding and development, but drifted fairly quickly towards infrastructure, and then eventually kind of focused in on the networking space. which brought me to Cisco. I came into Cisco as an engineer in our a sales engineer, a systems engineer, helping customers here in the Midwest of the U.S. with all things Cisco related. Kind of data center, a heavy data center focus, but also did a fair amount of
Mhm.
security and wireless. And then, as probably many of you kind of remember, the cloud and the automation and all these things started to become really, really interesting and also potentially scary, right? We weren't exactly sure what it meant for the future of network engineers or infrastructure as kind of the early days of cloud were out there. And I, for one, thought that it was just an opportunity, right, for all of us network engineers and infrastructure folks as automation came in, as the cloud became interesting. And so then I pivoted my career slightly, almost a little bit backwards, kind of back towards automation and programmability. And joined Adrian or NetGrew in the DevNet organization specifically to kind of really dive into network automation to understand what it meant for the regular network engineer's career, what skills were needed, how do we actually use some of these new tools like the early Ansible and Python and netconf and yang and try to make those consumable for folks like me that were just trying to figure stuff out. And I kind of followed that path, and that's kind of how I ended up here in the learning side, is still doing a lot of the same stuff, right? Trying to take what's interesting about technology today, understand it myself, and then break that down and help other people kind of make that same type of a leap. So that's kind of the I don't know, 5 minute how Hank got here type of a spiel.
Kind of on the surface, not really a deep dive, but very informative. And I mean, your Yang right explanations and NetConf, I still go back to them. That kind of was what made it work for me in my mind. That's what made it click. Is like right because you
Mhm.
kept hearing about Yang data models and NetConf, and then watching your videos and your content is actually what's like, oh, I see now, right? Augmentation of models. What's a data
Yeah.
model? And that kind of started making sense for me. So I'm sure that it also applies for a bunch of other folks that have watched your videos over the years. Cool. So
I
yeah,
credit my yeah that's where I credit my background in like theater and production and acting was to be able to try to figure out how to relay that. And I really count myself as lucky, and I'm always humbled still to talk to folks that mention like the videos, my conversations around trying to like, what is yang, what is it, why does it matter to us, like that. Those are some of the earliest stuff I did for DevNet, was to try to break those down, and they still come up, right? When I go out to an event like a Cisco Live, I'll still hear from folks that are going back to some of those resources to try to understand it as they make their own journey. And that's part of what I've really enjoyed about what we do. This kind of technical evangelism and advocacy is really just knowing that somewhere some engineer out there is struggling with something, and if they can stumble across this video or one of the other ones or a blog post that we've done or a learning lab, and it makes their life a little bit easier that day, right? It makes it all
it's
worth it.
totally worth it. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And talking about that, I mean, I know what Janeke, we had her just a couple of weeks here. We've had her twice on the live stream. She's a big fan of yours, by the way, right? She might be watching this, so a quick shout out to Janeke over there.
Uh-huh.
uh,
Oh yeah, she's fantastic. We met in person at a couple of Cisco Live events, and she's done fantastic things, kind of in the
yeah,
infrastructure as code space and working with those tools and really breaking down. And her, speaking of that, what we were talking before about taking things to production, right?
yeah.
The challenges she's had to solve, and I'm sure many of you kind of also watching have had to solve when you take something out of a tutorial or out of a demo or a readme someplace and then try to actually make it work. um, that's the most interesting part for me, is because that's where we can help each other improve, right? We find something that doesn't really work in the real world, well, let's roll that back up, because we need to know that as the folks that are building these examples and tutorials, right? We want these resources to be valuable, not just for a quick blog post or demo in the lab.
Right. So talking about resources, right, and the work you've done over the past couple of years with the learning and certs and infrastructure that they have there, the labs. I mean, we were talking about right NetBox to ICE, the project that
Mhm.
we're or the use case we're gonna talk today. So talk us about. how did you get to develop that? Like, what was the need
Oh
and
yeah.
what happened?
Yeah, no, it's the idea for me is I'm a huge fan of a source of truth, right? In infrastructure
Hmm.
and in networking in general. I'm also a big fan of automation. And when you bring the two of those together, the idea is that if I've got a source of truth, a location that has, let's say, an example, the network inventory or infrastructure inventory, right? And then we look at what do we have in our actual systems footprint, right? In a production environment, we've got lots of systems that have their own inventory or some aspect that controls what's relevant in there. And so for today's conversation, it's ICE. And so in our environment, we use Cisco ISE for a couple of things. We use it for device administration, right? So TACACS to make sure that when someone wants to log into a router, a switch, a server, a firewall, we verify who they are and what they're allowed to do. We also use it for VPN access with Radius, and we use it for some other aspects as well. Pretty common use cases for Cisco ISE, even outside of the more advanced kind of TrustSec and kind of campus wide and all those. So we have these issues, right? So ICE needs its inventory. It needs to know what are the devices in the environment, what types of devices are they active, what IP address do they have, is it an iOS device or a Nexus device or an ASA or a Firepower? What group, what role does it play, right? Is it just a lab device, is it a production device, is it a core device? There's all of this context we need in Cisco ISE so that we can build our policies appropriately. Well, all that context should be in your source of truth, right? That's the idea of having a source of truth on that side, is that it's you've got the data and I need the data. And to me, that's what one of the biggest things I've learned kind of doing automation in the real world, like with production systems, is that most network automation engineers aren't building gigantic systems. They're not building big network controllers, or they're not building like massive web servers, right? What do we do is our job as network automation engineers is the glue code, the glue utilities. We're writing things that take data from one system and make it useful in another, or we build reports, or we take data from a system and then we generate configs for a network device someplace. So that's a lot of what we do. And so that's kind of
Hmm.
the background for where this NetBox to ICE came in. Is I had all this data in NetBox and I needed it in ICE. And traditionally, what did we do? We did it, I'll say manually, but ICE has always had like import utilities, and I've used these before, right? You can go into ICE and you can import a CSV file that has a bunch of data, right? It's always provided some utilities for that, but that was still a manual approach, right? We had to generate the CSV file. We had to make sure we had to keep it updated. We had to make the changes and go through on that. And so I started to dig in and say, okay, I wanted to use this NetBox to ICE as a prototype for how we might do that same type of a inventory control from NetBox, which is our source of truth, but it could be any source of truth, into all of these systems that have their own inventories. And so, for example, we've got network monitoring tools that monitor to make sure that the environment is up and functional. Well, it needs its inventory, right? It needs to know what to monitor. It also needs to know when something like the monitoring tools are very important, right? Is that device active? Is it offline? Is it staged? Is it being upgraded? Is it decommissioning? Like those status flags that we have in our source of truths really impact monitoring. Our logging and capture and filtering pieces, right? So we send all of our syslog to systems, and we needed to make sure that our syslog servers could consume those appropriately. What's another inventory system? And so there's all of these inventory systems. And so I wanted to use this NetBox to ICE as the use case to say, okay, how could we do this, right? What's a framework, like a kind of a skeleton for how we might build a utility that can read data from NetBox, transform it appropriately so that it can then go into ICE and then populate ICE. And not as a one time. The goal here is not as a one time, right? We want this to run regularly. We want to be able to make sure that we're always in sync, or do reports to find differences and issues. And so that's kind of where we set in. I originally wrote the utility, I think back in 2021. I was just looking at it as we were getting prepped for the stream. So it's one we wrote quite a while ago, and it's been actively used in our production system for that purpose, kind of since it was released, right? So we don't have to go into ISE anymore and manually add in every time we add a new network switch or terminal server. We use some other automation tools to kind of make sure and track when things change, and we update and do sync pieces. And so it's pretty hands off at this point, and it's been super successful to kind of provide that use case for us.
Nice. So then you have like you run it on a regular schedule. You run it. Does it have webhooks? Do you get webhooks from
Mm.
NetBox? Like, what triggers
Yeah.
basically the sync?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I would say that, and it's not just network automation engineering, right? It's any type of work that's out there. But we always try to say, well, what's that first valuable piece, right? Sometimes referred to as MVP, minimal viable product. But for me, it's just like, what's the first thing that solves the problem we need today? And then there's always a whole list of things that we know we could do to improve, right? So it runs as a Docker container, makes it real modular, and then we set up a scheduled pipeline job in our CI/CD platform. We use GitLab, and so every 4 hours, the tool would run and just make sure that things were in sync. You mentioned webhooks. So NetBox has, and so that's one of the things in our backlog of features. But as I think anybody that's out there that knows, right, the backlog of features is always more bigger than we have time, and you've got to prioritize what goes in. And if you've got a solution that's meeting the needs, you don't always grab something just to make it a little better. And so years later, it still just runs it's either every 2 or every 4 hours, integrated in with our WebEx system. So we've got bots and rooms that'll pop up if things go wrong, if there's a failure, so we can track it. Um, the question that sometimes will come up is, all right, well, what happens if something changes, like you've got a device you're trying to log into, but it's like the tool hasn't run yet, and before the device is actually on and active, right? We're planning ahead. We got to figure out where's it going to go in the rack, right? How's it going to get cabled, assign the IP addresses effectively. So all that gets often done weeks, right? Potentially weeks before the device is even live. And so a 2 or 4 hour window is almost never an issue, right? Like run job, right? And just hit run job, and 45 seconds later, it's
Forces
done.
sync.
And so that's
Yeah.
kind of how we've gotten around that, but it doesn't happen that often.
Gotcha. All right. All right. So then I know you're gonna share this publicly, right, with folks in a repo on GitHub. Can they kind of like to pull add extra features and
Of course,
whatnot?
I have long been a proponent of the community side of building in network automation and helping each other out. Right, I've contributed to a handful of Python libraries and tools, and even back into NetBox with a few things. I've taken contributions from other people, so absolutely, right. There's all sorts of potential in the code even today from years ago when I wrote it that are just features that would be advantage. So I am completely open to folks kind of taking it, improving it, and going through. I will say, and if for folks, if you go and you look at GitHub where it's published right now, where we put the code up, I got a note in there, right? Kind of here's the price. That said, definitely take a look at it. Use it in a lab before you go to use it in your own production systems on that. But it should be useful. But it's like any good open source project, or stuff you pull off GitLab or GitHub or Stack Overflow. Buyer beware, right? Be careful,
Yep.
because you are going in and you're manipulating data. It does so much time and headache for typos and mistakes and things like that. So I encourage people to take a look at it, and if you're trying to solve a similar problem, either use it as inspiration or potentially as a foundation for the way you might solve your own solution. So.
Guys, I mean, definitely, this is that's just a
Mm.
really nice no-brainer use case for automation. All right.
And as mentioned, we've taken that as the start, and we now populate in other systems. So we take out a NetBox and we'll populate NSO. We populate Zabbix as our monitoring tool. We populate a bunch of stuff based on that same type of a concept. So
Gotcha. All right, then are we ready to the CLI?
I did, yep. And
You
so
did. All right.
I used it as an opportunity to learn a couple of libraries that I knew were out there, but I hadn't used a bunch yet. And one of them was Click. Click is a fantastic library for building kind of really robust, powerful CLI tools in Python. And then the other one that was new to me at the time that I really wanted to take advantage of was Rich. Rich provides like a nice framework for building kind of nice output and colors and tables. And so this was the first project that I really dove in with both of those libraries, and I really enjoyed using them. I've used them a lot since then. I've also done quite a bit. I've gotten a bit better at using both of them. And so as I was going through the code again and getting prepped for our demo, there are a few things that if I had a bunch of extra time, I'd love to go in and do some enhancements and kind of advantages. And maybe I'll call a few of those out as we're doing the demonstration. But back to that whole, your backlog is always bigger than the amount of time you've got available. And sometimes if something works, right, you know, it's really hard to justify going back and fixing or just doing incremental improvements. But awesome. All right. You want me
Cool.
just to kind of jump into this, or how do you want to approach
Cool.
this demo?
Yes, yes. So I see here, yeah, you're already logged into NetBox. Could you zoom in a bit, Hank,
Yep.
please? Like a couple of times,
Yep. I was
just
going to
for us
ask
to
you kind of how the
see what's.
display was.
There you go.
Is that good? Okay.
That's much better. Yes, that's good.
Perfect. Awesome. All right. So this is our NetBox system that we leverage to kind of maintain a bunch of the our infrastructure that's inside. And I've filtered this down to things that are going to be relevant for our demo today. And so inside of NetBox, I filter down to a site. I filter down to a role of terminal servers, so console servers to access resources, and then a particular tenant that just happens to have a few devices that you'll actually notice they're currently offline because it's just part of our it's a demo and a piece of gear that hasn't been stood fully up yet, but it's a place to start. We'll see, what does NetBox know about these devices? Well, it knows what platforms they are. So what type of device it is, it knows its location. It knows the IP address. It knows the platform, the version of software running on these. So it's all that source of truth stuff that we want. And in our demo here, I want to get this over into ICE. And let's see if ICE still has me logged in or if I'm going to have to log back in. I think I'm okay. All right. So here's ICE. So this is a demo ICE server that we have. I'm going to try to zoom in again here to make it
Yeah.
big. So I kind of flushed everything out of it. You also, for those of you that are familiar with ICE, you might be like, "Boy, Hank, that's a really old ICE server." Yeah, it is. But for this demo, it doesn't matter that much. The tool does work with kind of the more our actual production ICE servers is running a newer version of ICE on this as well. So we've updated the library to support newer versions of ICE as well. But we can see I've got no network devices added in. And my goal is I don't want to have to click the add device button and go populate things that are in there. And so I will switch over to, here we go. So here is VS Code, which has my pieces in here. Is that big enough, Adrian?
Yeah, that's good.
Excellent. Awesome. And so the way this tool is built is that it leverages a data file that describes what types of devices you want to add into NetBox. And it also obviously needs to know what NetBox server and ICE server to talk to. And so it's just a YAML file because I think these days YAML seems to be a good default. It's an easy way to kind of build the frameworks or build data files like this that are in there. And so I've got NetBox servers defined. We'll see it's got my URL here. So what's the address for my NetBox system? The ICE server, what's the address for the ICE server? So that's my demo ICE server that we're looking at. And you'll notice the token for our NetBox and then the credentials for ICE are all set to false. They're set to false because the tool's built that if those aren't specified in the data file, to look for environment variables for them, right? Secret management is a good thing, and that's one of the aspects of this tool that we built it in such a way to try to keep it kind of production grade. And one of the things that we worry about with production grade is to make sure that secrets are stored in a kind of a secure fashion. And so those are set and they get pulled in through environment variables. And then down below, there is this kind of block called jobs. And so the data file then considers every job is a collection. Basically, it's a query for NetBox of all the devices we're interested in, and then whatever the ICE config is that you're trying to accomplish. And so here we can see I'm going to query into NetBox, and it kind of matches the same thing we were just looking at. So which site, what tenant from NetBox am I interested in? What device status do I want? I actually had to add in offline as the status here. Typically, we don't populate the offline stuff. I would just do active or staged, but because of the demo, right? So I said, okay, I also want my offline
Mhm.
things. And then what device role? So I just want terminal servers. This query can also support device types. And so if I just wanted certain models of hardware and things like that, so it's a real flexibility to what we can query NetBox for. And then down below, what do I want to set? So here I've got ICE config, and there's no radius required for these ones. So I'm just setting the TACAX secret. If I did want to do radius, right, it would just be like you just put in radius, and then what is the secret for radius, right? So blah, whatever. But for these
Mhm.
ones, and maybe we'll do that in a second round of demo, we'll see how we could add that in. But just a secret here. Back to one of the enhancements that we've actually kind of considered in our backlog. The TACAX secret is it's also a secret. We use HashiCorp Vault for our secret management. So we've got a use case, or we've got something in our backlog to actually read the TACAX secret from Vault rather than including it in the data file that's here. We haven't added it in yet on that side, but that's the kind of enhancements and things that I think kind of continue to show that glue code, right? The idea here was originally just NetBox to ICE, but when we're talking about the TACAX secret, that's another source of truth. Our secret management tool could feed into this as well. So a potential enhancement for the tool that's in place. Questions on the data file?
So the data file, basically you just input your NetBox, ICE, and then kind of like the site, and it's gonna go and search that site for all the devices. Is
Yeah. So
that the
when we get
idea?
Yeah, so we'll get into well, depending on where we are in time, we'll likely get into some of the code. But the way that the code works is it kind of creates using the Pi NetBox library and then the NetBox API. It builds a filter request to make the
Mhm.
request out to NetBox. And so by telling it specifically what site and tenant and status, the API call that gets sent to NetBox is very kind of specific for just the devices that kind of match that's in here.
Targeted.
It's very targeted. Yep.
Gotcha.
Mhm.
Because
Yeah.
if not, this is for demo purposes. If not, you would just specify, give me all the devices from this data center type of thing. So the filter would be
Mhm.
much larger, right? Because you don't want to, I mean, what would be the benefit then if you have to configure everything in your YAML file? Might as well just go to ICE and add the devices individually at that point if you make your filters that narrow.
Sure. Yeah, our production job, I think in our production data file, we have, and you can see this in YAML, this job is a list, right? So it's just one.
Yeah.
But I think we've got 3 jobs. And the way that we break our jobs down are based on kind of tied back into ICE policy. So we've got one job that is kind of the standard network infrastructure, switches, firewalls, routers, right? That just have TACAX config. We'll have another job that kind of factors in for anything that's radius related, right? So if we're talking like VPN access and all those types of pieces, we've actually got a couple of applications that do radius for their authentication. And so like Cisco has Prime Network Registrar, which is a DNS and DHCP server. Its AAA authentication is radius based, right? So we've got a job that kind of sets the ICE objects up for CPNR servers, and then their ICE config block, right, has radius rather than TACX. And then the filters that are up here are used to kind of hone in and return the virtual machines out of NetBox that are the CPNR images. And then we might have, I think we've got another one for some, if you've got, that was the other use cases. You can see all of the return devices from this query will get the same TACX secret. If we had different blocks of devices that had different secrets, right, those would be different jobs. And so that's kind of how the data file can be used to meet whatever your demands are.
Gotcha. Makes sense. All right. So you get the YAML file with the data source,
Yep.
and what do you do next?
Yep. So we've got that, and then so now I've opened up my command line that's in here, and so I run netbox to ICE. It is a click-based application, so I'll just do a kind of a dash dash help on here, and we can see that the utility has 4 different commands available. It has check data file, which will read your data file, make sure that it's accurate if there's any problems, right? It provides some details. If you're new to the tool and you want an example data file, you can just do example data file and it'll spit out, here's a framework, right? So that you can build your own as needed. And then the two kind of action ones, there's a verify. Verify is like a dry run. So it does the query from NetBox, it looks at what's in ICE, and then it shows you whatever their differences are. So what's not in line, and we'll see how that works in a second. And then sync does the lookup from NetBox and then kind of does the population of ICE with what's in place. And so let's check our data file. So we'll do NetBox to ICE, check data file, and it's click again. So if I can go through and say, well, what do I need? You can see if there are any options. There's no real options for this one. And then I just have to give it what the data file is. And so I just need to say the data file is demo YAML. And so we can see it checks in. So what this check feature does is it reads the data file, makes sure that it kind of is valid YAML, has what's expected. And then it goes and says, well, can I actually talk to the NetBox server that's described? Can I talk to the ICE server that's described? And so it checks those. And we can see that I've successfully connected. Prior to the demo here, I sourced, you can see over here, and I'm not going to click on it because it's got actual credentials in it, but I've got this .env file that has the credentials and my tokens for all these systems. And so those are set in my terminal so that those can work on that side. Once that's done, then I'm going to go ahead and say, okay, well, let's do a verify first. And so we're going to say verify. What options do I have for verify? And so we can see I'll have to provide what is the data file, right? So that'll be the same one. We can see that I've got a couple other options here. I've got display group diff. And I'll do this with and without so we can see the difference on what the display is on that. And then I've got a debug option. Now back to one of the things I mentioned before, this is like my first click application I ever wrote. And so this form of debug and then having to type true or false after it, it's not the best way to do a click app. So this is, again, one of those enhancements because click, I should just be able to do -- debug, right? And then it defaults to true. Like there's ways to do that in click. When I built it the first time, I didn't know that was there. And so a little bit of kind of early days of Hank's Python coding in here. But that's the same thing. That's why these show Boolean as it be true or false. And so we'll do NetBox to ICE, and we'll do verify, verify, and then data file. Demo.yaml. And so we'll see here, and excellent. No, that's good enough. So if I scroll up a little bit, so what do we see in the output from the verification? Well, it rechecks to make sure everything's good. So it goes ahead and says, okay, yep, I can communicate with both NetBox and ICE. And then the first thing it does is it looks up all of the current devices and groups from the ICE server. What I wanted to do with this tool was not just always just push config into a system because ICE is pretty good. Most systems are pretty good, but every 4 hours, I don't want to just kind of be rewriting the configuration that's not necessary. I just want to figure out what changes are required and kind of do state-based changes. Just fix the things that are wrong. And so I've got to look up the current information. And then we go ahead and say, okay, use the job, right? We can see even here from job demo, it goes and queries everything from NetBox based on what was in the data file. And then it compares the two. It compares what's in ICE today to what the job says should be in ICE based on there. And then it will go ahead and we can see determine the diffs between the current and the desired. So this is kind of getting that to that idempotent kind of ephemeral type of a goal. And then in the verification, it kind of comes through and says, well, what is the status? And we saw that there were no devices in ICE so far. So we can see both of my console servers are missing is the status. And then it kind of outlines all of the fields for the devices that need to be updated. In this case, they're missing. So this just kind of gives you the full breakdown, I guess, in this block, the full breakdown of what's going to be configured. And then we can also see in what device groups, network device groups in ICE that will be used for this device. The way the tool is built is it looks at things from NetBox, like the tenant membership, the device role, the device type, and then uses those to create groups in ISE, because a lot of times when we're building ISE policies, we need to know what tenant was it in, right? What type of device is it? What platform is it? Because all that determines kind of how the actual TACX or radius policies have to be crafted. And so this tool will go ahead and build groups in ISE that align to kind of how the objects are represented in NetBox themselves. So we get some consistency between the two of them. And then down at the bottom, just kind of a summary of, well, there was just 2 devices that were output. So that's our verification. Questions before we do our sync and see if it works?
No, this makes sense. And you basically control with that data YAML file the filter, like you were saying. So that's why it picked up the missing, even if though it's offline, because you specified, yeah, I want even the offline devices to be shown. So that's why they show up in here.
Yeah. And as an example, if we go into our data file and I comment out the offline status, and then I
And you run it
rerun the
again, it's not going to show
verification,
anything, right? Yeah.
should be nothing. Oh, yeah. And so here's another case. It comes back none type is an iterable because it didn't return anything. So this is one of those. I actually had an argument, or not an argument, a conversation with one of our other developers on the team about another project that's underway. Python's always got that, like in the Zen of Python, it's right. Errors shouldn't pass silently, like be loud when something breaks. And so I fully embraced it here, is that it went through and said none's in there. Now, all that said, this is probably something that would be more, it'd be an area to catch and provide a much better error message on the side. But because nothing was returned, right, and we can see what was it doing, right? It was trying to print devices from the diff, and it's like, well, I'm trying to loop over status from devices diff. Devices diff was none, right? There's nothing in there, so it shoots out an error. So little explanation of how that goes in. So I'll put the offline back in, rerun, and now we should be back to where we were. All right.
Yep.
Cool. All right.
Yep.
So next step, let's do the sync, right? So we'll do NetBox to ISE, sync. We'll check our help. We'll see, okay, what do I need? I've got data files, text, the YAML file. I've got that debug flag if I want to see more debug messages. And then here's one that is remove extra. Here's a, and I think I'd have to go back through and look. This is one of those dangerous things when you're synchronizing systems together, right? It's one thing to create objects that we know that we need, but what do you do if there's an object in ISE that isn't in NetBox? Do I want to delete it, right? What am I potentially going to break if somebody manually added a device in ISE? And it's not in NetBox, right? That's potentially very disruptive. And so I got a flag in here to say, do you want to remove them? The default is no, right? It just leaves anything extra in ISE alone, because that's generally probably what we want to do. It's certainly the safest thing to do on that. So I will sync. We will tell
Would
it our
that
data
show up
file.
in the verify dry run command, Hank? It would
It's
not, huh?
I don't think it does today. I think there's actually a to-do in the function for doing the verification in the diff that I remember seeing as I was going through this morning, is like need to deal with extra devices. I think they're just not being printed right now on that side.
Gotcha.
Sorry. So NetBox to ISE will sync our data file, and so now it's going to run. All right, so super quick here because there wasn't a lot of data to work with. So you can see it's syncing network device groups. So before it can add a device, all of the groups that device is going to be a member of have to already exist. And so the tool went through and said, okay, well, I need groups based on the tenant that these devices are members of. And so it went ahead and said, okay, well, it needed to create this group, this pre-01 Z0 admin group. And we can see it was created because it was currently missing. And then we can see, okay, well, pre-01, TS, console 01, and X201 and X301 were both created and added successfully. So nice results that kind of come out of this. If I do my verification again, we should see no changes are needed. And correct. So now they come back and say their status is correct. No changes required on that side. Cool.
Nice.
We'll go check it actually in ISE. And so if I refresh my screen.
You'll get the two terminal servers added to ICE, the correct groups,
It should be.
and you can apply the correct policy to this.
Mhm.
And you
Yeah, in
have
this case,
TACX configured.
yeah. And the idea here, typically, right, the policies are probably already configured, but now that once the devices get added in, they'll have them applied successfully. The dreaded loading bubble. Come on. There it goes. All right. So there's my two devices. So I've got them in place, right? We can see their IP mask, their profiles, their locations are there. If I hover over that too long, we can see their types that are in place. If I go in and I'll just click on one of these, we can take a look at it. You'll notice one of the things I did is for the description of the device, I actually put a link back to the API endpoint in NetBox for this. We haven't used this before, but what I wanted to do was to provide an ability for maybe another tool to say, well, if it needed a query from ICE and, well, where did this device come from, right? So it's my reference back. Like, so where did this come out of? Its IP address is assigned. Here we can see all those details. So it's what location? It's in 26U, right? So it's 26U. If I click on this, the way the locations kind of get broken down are from the site, so RCD09, and then what rack is it in? So we can see these all represent racks, and then the U would come in underneath it. Which device am I on? X2. Which rack is it in? It's in 26U. Oh, okay. No, yeah. The U is throwing me off. I thought that was the U in the rack, but that's just the rack that it's in. So underneath RCD09, we can see 26U is listed, and then we can see all the other racks that we've got gear in. The device type. So what device type is it? Well, it's this type of a device, and the device type groups inside of ICE kind of go by manufacturer here. So I've got Cisco, and then I go in, we can see all the different device types. And again, this whole list is synchronized from NetBox so that we can kind of keep them accurate and consistent. There's the tenant that was created, the device role that was created. If I look in, we can see all the different roles that are available that have been kind of set up. And then the actual TACX configuration that's been set. So it's all in place. To show you kind of how the update and the change happens, let's say I went in here and I changed the credential to something else. Right, so I'm just going to manually change the TACX credential. We'll save that off. I will go back. So now we'll run that verification again. And so what do we see? We see X301 is correct, but X201 is incorrect. And we can see, okay, well, the root TACX setting shared secret is currently set to this. That's just whatever I happen to randomly type on the keyboard, but it's supposed to be this, right? So this needs to be updated from a verification, and we can see the groups are all correct. But if I had changed one of the group memberships, right, it would have shown that as well. And so now I could go ahead and rerun the sync data file. And we can see, okay, so this is an interesting one for me. When we go through and do the correction, the status was updated, right? And we can see, well, what had to be changed? So we can see the different things that were changed. Looks like there's a bug in the description. It thought it had to reset it, but obviously the description was the same because I didn't change it. But we can see the TACX setting was adjusted to be fixed. So it's a really nice way, again, to audit trail, right? What was changed? Why was it changed on that side? Questions?
Nice. This is really nice. So you do track changes for devices that are already there. If the changes have been done manually, for example,
Oh yeah,
in ICE GUI, you just are not tracking devices that have been manually added into ICE with the verify command. Is like, and you're not overriding those at this point, but you are checking all the configuration changes that might have been done manually by somebody. That's really cool.
It is, yeah. And that whole extra devices piece that's there, it's one we've kind of gone back and forth. We've been doing this for a while. The tool's been in place for a while, but we still have some devices in our ICE servers that were manually created ages ago before we were using the tool. And so we've got policies based on how they're set up. And so we've had to be a little bit cautious. It's always easier to do automation from the start and then maintain it, but trying to come into a brownfield environment can be difficult. And so we've erred on the side of, okay, if we're pushing the configs out, right, we'll continue to own them. But for stuff that has eventually needs to be kind of manually touched, particularly around anything related to RBAC control, right? Authentication is a dangerous thing to be working on. So
Makes sense. Makes sense.
yeah.
So this is great. All right. Any other features that we want to look at, or should we jump into code a bit?
No, not really a features thing. Well, the debug we can look at, right?
Oh, the
So if I go
debug.
through,
Yes.
yeah, so we'll give an idea of kind of what it looks like. So let me go back into ICE, and I'm going to change something. We'll change the IP address this time. So instead of 54, I'm going to say 154, just to give us some bit of data that's different. Okay, I change that, and so now we'll rerun the verification, but I'm going to do debug true. We'll get lots more data. So much
Right.
more
So that
data that comes
actually shows you the API and calls
through.
and payloads. And okay, I see. You get your gets
Yeah.
probably. Yeah.
And so some of this comes down to my own development approach. And we'll look at that when we get into some of the code but it's a very modularized utility. And so I wrote code to talk to NetBox, and I wrote code to talk to ICE, and I wrote code that does the difference comparison and the conversion and pieces. And each one of those functions, I actually put a debug flag into to print out kind of every step along the way, so that when I was writing and debugging, I could see what the heck was going on when things, because this seems right. It might sound like, oh, it's a simple thing: read data from NetBox, populate ICE. Well, the data formats are different, and there's
Yep.
one of the things we'll see. There are device name restrictions and differences between the platforms that had to be normalized against, and there's a bunch of that type of stuff that had to go in. And so even a tool that might seem as straightforward as this has a lot that has to happen. And so putting in kind of the ability to debug at option is super useful. It's probably why so many of the like production and other so many things have debug or verbose flags. I find them super useful. But what do we see? So here we can start to see some of the messages. So looking up current devices and groups from the ICE server. And so we can see it sent ICE get devices, and it's the library that's being used is another community library for interacting with ICE is what this uses under the hood. And so it sends it off and says, okay, well, what is the response from there? And then it goes through and pulls details for every single ICE device that's in place. So all the output kind of gets shown in my debug that's here. And then I get, okay, well, here are the current devices that are currently in ICE. And if I go and I find somewhere in here is the X2 that I just reset. No, that's not. There's a what's in one. Find
It's
it.
fairly
I just broke.
verbose.
There it is. Yeah. Well, so right here is the block. Somewhere in here's the block for the device I just updated, and I know that because I just spotted the IP address. Oh, there it is. 154. So there's the IP address I just changed. So we can see it's got the data from from ICE has been collected. And then it comes down here, and this is super lots of data. It got all the device groups that are currently in ICE, because we've got to compare those to what we need based on the devices that are in place. So there's this giant list of groups. They get processed. Come down a little farther. We'll get into the NetBox queries. Yeah, here we go. And so here's where it says, okay, now we're going to go generate the config from NetBox. And so you can see it pulled data from PyNetBox. And then there is the device query. So based on the data file, right, these are the attributes. These are the parameters that are going to be used to query for device. So what's the site ID? In the data file, the site was RCD09. Well, that site ID in NetBox is the number 9. The role was terminal server, while the role ID is 17. So the tool goes and figures out like what are the appropriate query attributes to actually search for a device. This demonstration didn't have any virtual machines because we were just targeting terminal servers, but if a VM query was going to be done, it issues those. We can see here, right? It knows. It went and looked at the role. The only role we said was terminal server. Terminal server is not a virtual machine role in NetBox. It's just a device role. So it says, all right, well, we're not going to look for VMs, right? We'll save some time. And then it goes through and we can start to see the output for each of the devices. So here's the one console server, here's the other console server. And then what we see in this block, this is based on NetBox, right? What should the ICE device look like? So this we saw up above was the actual ICE device payload. This is what it's supposed to look like. And sure enough, we can see right here, right? There's the IP address it's supposed to be, right? It's supposed to be .54. And so once it's kind of collected all the desired devices, then the system can go through and say, okay, well, we know the current, we know the desired, let's find the differences, right? Let's compare the two together. And so it goes and processes, and we can see, okay, well, which ones exist? We can see, so there's no devices missing, and in this system, there's no devices extra. So under the hood, like, it can know that they're there, but we're not processing or showing them. And then we can see the differences that are in place. And so trying to find the one that's relevant for what we're looking at. Here it is, I think. Yeah, here it is. So I highlighted the start of console 2 where we made the change. What we can see here is this is in the dictionary that gets generated, is there's a value change requirement for the IP address. So we can see that the old value is this one, the new value is supposed to be this one. And so inside of Python, I'm using a difference library to kind of find what are the differences between the current and the desired. And then it knows what to focus in and process and actually make changes to. I'm gonna skip past a whole bunch of this output. But then we get down here. And so now, because you can see kind of the debug, like how it created these dictionaries and these sets that were used, how it knows exactly what needs to be changed. Oh, apparently I still had it was on the page. I reset the TACX setting as well. And those are in place. Questions?
Nice. So, I mean, this was pretty quick, right? Is there any threading happening in the background, or is it just like one threaded app? The environment is not big enough to actually require multi-threading in your case. Like, is that an improvement that you see going down for folks that have like even larger environments?
Yeah. So I would say that the Pi NetBox library that's being used has some kind of enhancements, and I offload a little bit of the threading and the optimizations for interacting with the backend platforms to those libraries themselves. And so I can pick up from whatever those community libraries do. But from actual threading of this application, it's procedural, right? It does one step at a time. Um, I can say that when we run this in our system, I mean, we're several hundred devices that are getting processed, and even running it every 4 hours. Like, it doesn't take too long to go in. If this was used in an environment that had tens of thousands of devices, and running a verification or a sync was taking a long time, sure, there's always room for potential optimizations, and kind of maybe don't diff things like one dictionary. Like, yes, there's always room for improvement, but it's, again, one of those things that, I mean, even running this in our production environment is quite quick. It does not take that long. So
Gotcha. What else comes to mind? Other integrations. So you said you build the code is modular, right? Can you add, you have your ICE integration, right? Downstream. Can you get like ServiceNow, how difficult it is, or Zabbix, like you were saying, or syslog?
yeah, so let's say that you wanted to use this as a framework, but you didn't have NetBox. You had ServiceNow as your source of truth. The way that the code was written, so if I switch back and we look at it a little bit, you can see I've got a Python library for ICE interactions and a Python library for the NetBox interactions, and then there's the CLI utilities. And I'm just being conscious of time. I know we're down to like the last 5. It's amazing how quick an hour goes when you really dive
I
into
know.
something. But like, if I wanted this to be like a service now, right? So the CLI utilities right now call the functions from the NetBox piece to generate the data in a certain way, and then calls them from ICE to go through. So from a modular, from that type of perspective, sure, you could have a servicenow.py that had similar functions, right? We'd have to have similar library calls that could be called instead, and then call those instead to generate the same types of data that's in place. So
Nice, nice. So it's nicely organized, modular. You can easily extend it or bring in other pieces. Just bring in your
yep.
code and build on top of this.
And I know that when we did you mentioned like for Zabbix to sync to that instead. So I didn't write our Zabbix sync tool, but the engineers that did used this library as an example, and so pulled out like a lot of the NetBox reads and the way the queries were done, to kind of reuse some of that code there. It could certainly have been modularized to a point, so it could have just been those could have been imported rather than kind of vectored in. But there's always some tweaking and specific things that have to change in any project like that. So.
And there's actually libraries for both ICE Python libraries, right? You didn't go API endpoint by API endpoint. It's both for ICE and NetBox. You were mentioning PyNetBox, and for ICE, they should have like an SDK or.
So I wrote this again. It was several years ago, and so I'm using the Pi ICE ERS, so the ERS APIs for ICE. With ICE 3.1, there was a whole new REST API built for it, but when I started, it was just the ERS APIs. And so I'm using a library that was written by Falk in the community for it to do all the ICE integration. With the move to the REST APIs, I imagine at some point kind of rebuilding this and using the default kind of the Cisco provided REST API SDK would be it's a likely thing that'll have to happen in the future, because at some point the ERS APIs are going to get decommissioned, deprecated. That was the word I was looking for. And we'll have to switch over. And then I would switch to that library. And ideally, we would just have to update these functions that I built, right? The verify ICE and the sync and the lookups under the hood to use instead of the ERS object, whatever the new one is. And hopefully the payloads are close enough where it doesn't require like thousands of hours of rewriting. But we can tackle that. I was very happy when ICE 3 came out that they still had ERS APIs and the new ones, which meant that the tool still worked. But we know we've got a note in our backlog that we do have to eventually migrate this over to the REST APIs.
Gotcha. Very nice. This is super useful. And we're almost top of the hour. The time passes just too fast. Folks, any questions? I've seen a bunch of people watching on YouTube, on LinkedIn. Let us know if you have any questions. Oh, let me share the link to the repo actually with everyone. So there we go. So folks, right? I think the use case is definitely there for being automated. I think it's a really good one. Hank has done all the heavy lifting. Basically, there's some improvements that can be done, but you can use this as inspiration for sure. He's taking pull requests to this repo, right? So if you want to improve, you want to contribute, do it. Use this, like Hank was saying, first, give it a try in a lab environment before you jump in straight to production. But yeah, any final words before we wrap up, Hank?
No, just thank you for letting me come and kind of chat about a project that we built, and definitely take advantage of as it goes in. It's always fun to kind of share the work and hear feedback from other folks on pieces that are there. And if someone out there does take a look at this and have some ideas for improvements, yes, absolutely, send a pull request. I would love to see those and take advantage of that. So.
And Bill is just asking over there. Can we have a link? I've just pasted it.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So thank you so much, Hank. And if you have anything else you want to share with us, you're more than welcome to here on the live stream at any point. Let me know. We'd love to have you back again. Thank you. Thanks everyone for watching. We're recording this. Next week, we're going to have a session. I'll be at Ansible Fest presenting a bunch of labs over there. So we'll be picking back up again the week after. We'll go over some telemetry with iOS XE, with Jeremy and Story. So see you on the next one. Thanks for joining. Thanks again, Hank. And folks,